Hello guys, welcome to another episode of Forgotten Uniques. In this series I'm covering unique items in Path of Exile that aren't used very much, if at all, looking at use cases and potential synergies with other mechanics, especially in regards to things such as ascendancy changes or new unique items that have been added to the game more recently. We're a handful of episodes in by now, so if you'd like to check out the rest of the series, I'll link the playlist in the description below. Today's video is all about Fated End, a unique ring which is exclusive to Heist League content, and it can be found rarely in the end room of blueprints, and this ring has a bit of an interesting history. Fated End was added to the game as part of the Heist League release in patch 3.12, and as part of this release, GGG added a new mechanic to the game in an attempt to incentivize self-cast curses. This was the Doom mechanic. Doom was essentially a counter that would exist on any Hex curse skill that you cast yourself, which would then gain Doom over time, and Doom translated into increased curse effect. As part of patch 3.12, some old mechanics were updated for the inclusion of Doom, while some new unique items were also added to help support this new mechanic, and one of them was the new ring, Fated End. But as you can see, this item no longer has any stats related to Doom, and that's because patch 3.20 completely removed the Doom mechanic in a massive change to Hex curses, which would see the hidden, less curse effect penalty on bosses removed from the game entirely. Fated End then was changed to do something very similar to what it used to do, albeit without the existence of the Doom mechanic. So let's take a look at the modifiers on this unique ring. There's some intelligence and increased curse skill cast speed, once again incentivizing self-cast curse skills. Not much to write home about with these two modifiers. But then we get to the two unique modifiers on this ring. Non-aura hexes gain 20% increased effect per second. So curse effect is a very powerful stat, and that's why it's hard to come across on gear and the passive skill tree. There's a total of just 40% increased curse effect available on the passive skill tree, 60% if you include the mastery for increased curse effect when 50% of curse duration has expired. But most of the other curse effect available on the tree is made up from 5% increases on the small nodes. Fated End will provide 20% increased effect of your Hex curse skills per second once they've been applied, but this comes at the cost of the second unique modifier here. Non-aura hexes expire upon reaching 180 to 220% of base effect. Important here is the wording, base effect, not increased effect. So when a Hex curse reaches the specified base effect, it immediately expires. As an example then, let's say I have a level 20 flammability curse and I was using a Fated End ring with an average roll of 200% base effect. When flammability is first cast, the cursed enemy will have minus 36% to fire resistance and have plus 25% chance to be ignited. Every second that passes, flammability gains 20% increased effect. So after 1 second has passed, the flammability curse is applying minus 43% to fire resistance and plus 30% chance to be ignited. After 3 seconds has passed, flammability is applying minus 57% to fire resistance and plus 40% chance to be ignited. However, upon reaching 5 seconds of duration passed, flammability would have 100% increased effect, at which point it means it's reached 200% of base effect, so the curse expires due to the modifier on Fated End. One thing to note here is that curse effect isn't gained in increments of 20% per second, but instead is gained in much smaller amounts over shorter intervals, and you can actually see this in effect right here. In this example, we're self-cursing to actually show this effect, and instead of gaining a chunk of minus resistance every second, it instead consistently ticks down over time. And this is very important because the base effect roll on Fated End's modifier matters a lot. As the closer you're able to get to the 220% base effect max roll, the higher your average curse effect will be. That's the average that is gained from the ring when you consider the full curse duration, beginning with no curse effect all the way up to potentially 120% increased effect at 6 seconds. However, another important note is that Fated End doesn't only consider the increased curse effect provided by itself. The modifier which makes curse skills expire at a percentage of base effect takes into account all of the modifiers to curse effect no matter their source. So if the character already had 20% increased curse effect from other sources in the flammability example from earlier, the flammability curse would have expired after 4 seconds had passed, because it would reach the 200% base effect 1 second sooner. Now, if you have perfect uptime on curse application with no other modifiers to curse effect and a max rolled 220% base effect fated end, you'd average out at 60% increased curse effect, which would be reached halfway through the 6 second curse duration. But fated end starts to get a lot stronger the more curses you're able to utilize. For example, on a cold damage build using a level 20 Frostbite and Elemental Weakness, the average of 60% increased curse effect would provide an additional minus 39% resistance. That's pretty much another curse in terms of the amount of negative resistance gained. Meanwhile, for poison builds, Temporal Chains slower expiry modifier is increased from 25% to 40%. In fact, Temporal Chains is one of the very strong combinations with fated end. This is because modifiers to slower expiry rate have increasing returns. Let's take a look at an example. So let's take the base poison duration of 2 seconds to showcase this example. A level 20 Temporal Chains with no modifiers to curse effect applies a 25% slower expiry rate of effects. This would make a 2 second poison last for 2.66 seconds, or an effective increased duration of 33.3%. 1 second into the duration, fated end increases curse effect by 20%, so Temporal Chains now applies a 30% slower expiry rate, and a 2 second duration poison would now last 2.857 seconds, or an effective increased duration of 42.85%. 2 seconds into the duration, fated end increases curse effect by 40%, so Temporal Chains now applies a 35% slower expiry rate, and the 2 second poison now lasts for 3.076 seconds, or an effective increased duration of 53.84%. Then, 3 seconds in, we have a 60% increased curse effect for 40% slower expiry rate, and the 2 second poison now lasts for 3.33 seconds, or an effective increased duration of 66.6%. At 4 seconds, with 80% increased effect, it's a 45% slower expiry rate, and the 2 second poison lasts for 3.63 seconds, or an effective increased duration of 81.8%. Then at 5 seconds, with 100% increased effect for a 50% slower expiry rate, the 2 second poison lasts for 4 seconds, or an effective 100% increased duration. Do keep in mind though that Temporal Chains' slower expiry rate modifier is a persistent buff, so the actual duration those poisons last will vary because the magnitude of the expiry rate modifier is constantly changing. But you can see that each second, the same amount of curse effect is gained, but the effective increase in duration goes up with each increment to curse effect stacking on top of each other. Which means that unlike other hex curses that lower monster resistances, for example, Temporal Chains gains a lot more out of the last half of the duration, when the most benefit is gained from the increasing effect. Now, how do you go about applying 2 or more curses every 5 or 6 seconds if necessary? Arcanist Brand isn't going to work, as it will continuously reapply the curses while it's active. You could of course self-cast these curses if you wanted to. However, earlier I mentioned that Fated End's base effects modifier takes into account all modifiers to curse effect, and that's a really important fact because this means that it also takes into account any reductions or less modifiers to curse effect. This means that you can use Bane or even Hex Touch support to apply several curses at once with a single ability. Bane has 25% less effect of applied curses, while Hex Touch has 35% less effect. Even with the less effect modifier, if the curses have a long enough duration, they'll still reach enough effect to cap out and expire. But due to the less effect modifier, the ramp time is going to be longer. For example, using Bane to apply curses, you'll have a starting base effect of 75%, and every 20% increased effect gained from Fated End per second will only add 15% to the base effect counter due to that less effect modifier. This means that instead of a Hex Curse lasting 6 seconds to ramp from 100% base effect to a max rolled 220% base effect, it would instead take 9.66 seconds to go from 75% base effect to 220% base effect. Using this method, the longer ramp time will mean that you'll need to apply the curses less often, while only the first 2 seconds of the 9-second duration of the curse has a lower curse effect than 100% base effect, For the rest of the duration following that point, the curses will be continuously gaining strength above 100% of their base effect until they reach the cap and expire. If you wanted to increase the ramp time even more, or if your build can't fit in the extra link to use Bane and you wanted the curse duration to be longer, you could make use of the Hex Master keystone. Hex Master is located right at the top of the passive skill tree near Eldritch Battery. This keystone makes your curses have 20% less effect, but makes any curses you apply have infinite duration. Now, importantly, this doesn't mean that the Hex will persist at full effect forever, as Fated End's modifier will override the one on Hex Master, so that the Hex curse will still expire when it reaches the specified amount of base effect. However, the less effect on this keystone can be used to further delay the ramp time on your curses, either on its own or alongside Bane or Hex Touch support. Using the Hex Master keystone alongside Bane, your Hex curses will take 13.33 seconds to go from 60% base effect to a max rolled 220% base effect. With less than 25% of that duration, that's the first 3.33 seconds, having less than 100% curse base effect. So you're afforded a much longer period of time to be able to output damage before you need to reapply your curses. Now, there is another bit of tech here using the Hex Master keystone with Fated End, and really, I've saved the best bit till last with this one. Self-cursing with Temporal Chains is a mechanic that you can utilise to make temporary effects last longer on you. To make effective use of this interaction, you'll want to avoid the other part of Temporal Chains, that's the action speed slow part of the Hex. You can do this in many different ways. For example, the Calm's Roots unique boots grant the modifier action speed cannot be modified to below base value. You can also find this modifier on the Juggernaut's Unstoppable Ascendancy Notable, and if your build is making use of an Animate Guardian, you could equip the Garb of the Ephemeral on this minion to provide this modifier to all allies around the Animate Guardian, including your character. Meanwhile, the Trickster has access to a similar modifier on the One Step Ahead Ascendancy Notable, which makes your action speed have a guaranteed minimum value of 108% of its base value. If you can't access any of these modifiers, you can of course always just try to counter the less action speed stat on Temporal Chains with your own modifiers to increased action speed. For example, things like Tailwind and the Deadeye's Gathering Winds Ascendancy Notable, or other mechanics like Self-Chill using Winterweave. Okay, here's the thing. Self-Curse Temporal Chains has been nerfed time and time again over many leagues due to how powerful it once was. In patch 3.10 Delirium League, the 40% reduced effect on player characters modifier was replaced with 50% less effect on players, making it much harder to meaningfully scale curse effect. Then in patch 3.22 Ancestor League, the slower expiry rate of effects modifier on Temporal Chains was nerfed from 40% to 25%. This change happened due to the strength of poison builds, but this one really hurt Self-Curse Temporal Chains as well. Then, just last league, Labyrinth Helmet enchantments were removed as well, so Temporal Chains lost some potential effect scaling there too. Needless to say that Self-Curse Temporal Chains is a shadow of what it once was, and the last time I saw a lot of experimentation with this mechanic was all the way back in 3.19, Kalandra League, due to the reversed curse effect rings that you could make. The reason that Self-Curse Temporal Chains isn't used all that often anymore is because it's really hard to scale the curse. With the 50% less effect on players, the baseline slower expiry rate of effects modifier is just 12.5%. However, remember that Fated End takes into account all modifiers to curse effect, including this 50% less effect on players modifier. This means that you can reach the 220% max roll base effect on Self-Curse Temporal Chains inclusive of the 50% less effect modifier. To do this, we'll use the Hex Master Keystone and the Shackles of the Wretched unique gloves. An important note here is that Hex Master's 20% less effect of curses modifier doesn't apply to curses you reflect back to yourself. This is potentially a bug, we're not too sure, but it's been well known for over a year as a bug report was submitted back at the end of 2022. Anyway, this means that our Temporal Chains duration is infinite due to Hex Master, and when we reflect this Hex curse back to ourselves with the Shackles of the Wretched, it will have 50% less effect on us, so the base effect begins at 50%. Every second, the curse will gain 20% increased effect from Fated End, which translates into 10% increased base effect due to the 50% less effect modifier. With this combination of mechanics, the self-cursed Temporal Chains will take 17 seconds to go from 50% base effect to 220% base effect before expiring. By the time it reaches 220% base effect, you will have reached 55% slower expiry rate of effects, which is kind of crazy. Remember that you don't want to be recasting Temporal Chains until it expires naturally, or it will begin from 50% base effect again. With this setup, you'll average out on 33.75% slower expiry rate of effects on you, which is the equivalent of 50% increased duration of temporary effects. This can be used for a lot of interesting build concepts, including setups which maintain Vow duration skills permanently, using the slower expiry rate of effects modifier to bypass Vow soul gain prevention. Now, compared to the other uniques I've covered in this series so far, Fated End is at least used a little bit at the moment, mostly on the same Poisonous Concoction Scion build which uses it to leverage the respectable damage increase that's obtained from boosted Temporal Chains on enemies. But I'd say it's still quite underused, especially earlier in a league's lifecycle when bossing characters can gain a huge damage boost from this ring. To add to that, self-cursed Temporal Chains with Fated End is an interesting, albeit niche option too, that should be explored a little bit more. Thank you as always to my channel supporters over on Patreon. If you enjoy the content I make here on YouTube, consider becoming a patron and supporting this channel going forward. All of the information can be found by following the link in the description below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.